Hi, everybody. Today we're going to do a scenario regarding a gentleman who is having challenges at work and what happens when the supervisor doesn't quite understand what their job is. So, Donovan has a struggle with a medical condition that affects his mobility, and it's impacting his ability to perform the functions of his job. Some of the functions. He formally requests an accommodation. Now, what do you think that means, to formally request an accommodation? As soon as you know, or you should have known, that an employee has a medical condition that is impacting their ability to perform the functions of their job, you've been informed. Oh, I'm really having a hard time typing today. There's something wrong that's really impacting me. You've been informed. Now, is that formally or not? If you've got a concept that requires employees to fill out a document and formally do something, you've missed this concept. As soon as you know or should have known, you got a workers' comp note that an employee has a medical issue that impacts the ability of them to perform the essential functions of their job, you just got a formal request for an accommodation. Now, why doesn't that happen? Well, let's talk about the scenario. Donovan's manager, unfamiliar with the ADA or the interactive process or a good faith meeting, delays his request. He's assuming it's an HR issue. Well, it is an HR issue. And we want Donovan's supervisor to make sure, absolutely, that he is getting Donovan to HR. So what we're trying to do with supervisors is train them to do this, to do this, to do this, and to do this, and don't do this, and don't do this, and don't do this. Supervisors never talk about medical conditions with an employee. HR doesn't ever call doctors, by the way, either, everybody. If you're calling them from one person, you've got to call them for every medical issue that you have a challenge with. So let's not call medical doctors unless the employee is requesting us to assist them in clarifying the medical issue. And that could mean that we're getting a HIPAA release to be able to even have that conversation with the employee, with the medical provider, to help them understand their responsibilities. But Donovan's supervisor didn't do anything. And then the accommodation got ignored. The employee got frustrated. And now his medical issue is even being more impacted because he kept trying to work with his challenges. So what we're trying to do is make sure managers are very clearly aware of the ADA, of the Pregnancy Workers Fairness Act, of Family Medical Leave Act, and of workers' comp if you have it in your state. And they need to know and be trained on what their responsibility is if they are aware under any of these issues, which they don't know the regulations unless they've studied them themselves. They're not at this podcast. So we just want them to be aware enough to know that if an employee comes up to them and asks for help that has to do with a medical related issue of any kind, they are, number one, not inquiring about the medical issue. They're making sure they're getting to HR. They're calling the HR rep and saying, I have Donovan with me. He would like to speak with you confidentially. We're letting Donovan know this is confidential. We are making sure we understand and the manager understands there will be no retaliation. We'll make sure the manager is trained to understand that other employees, if they're gossiping or complaining, will be stopped, because that's not appropriate for an employee who is having medical challenges to have to experience either. So our goal with the management training that we do is very clearly train your managers to understand what they're responsible to do when an employee informs them in any other way, or they get informed in any way that they believe an employee is having a challenge that is medically related in performing the of their job. Now, that's very different, everybody, than not being able to perform their job. We are documenting as managers employees who are unable to perform their job. And if we've got an employee who's been a great employee and then all of a sudden is having challenges, there's something going on. So let's sit down as a manager and say, is there anything impacting your ability to do your job? And if say, yeah, Joe is really doing this to me, that's a complaint. We're taking it to HR. Or, I'm really having trouble with my shoulder now, and I'm not sure what it is. but it's impacting when I do this. Thank you for telling me. Let me get you to HR. I can tell you my experience as an expert witness, and I've been doing this for over 20, 30 years, that when managers are making decisions about accommodations, they don't have your experience. Maybe they're looking at a sheet that they've looked at before from an workers' comp company that put together a really nice outline of what they can do and not do. That's okay. If you want to start there and you're just looking at restrictions and not talking about medical issues. But if you get to the point where the manager's saying, I can't do that, that's not okay. That's called an undue hardship. We are not in a position in HR, in my experience, to allow a manager to make an undue hardship decision. I am getting documentation. I am getting objective data. I am observing myself. I am confirming that I have real objective data to support why we can't provide that accommodation. And if I come to that conclusion, I'm going right back to that accommodation analysis, back to that good faith meeting, and I'm trying to identify an alternative accommodation. I'm also asking the employee, do they agree? Are they aware the accommodation is not effective in helping them get their job done? Did they know? Let's talk to them. Let's interact. It's called a good faith interactive meeting because we are acting in good faith. We are trying and we're trying and we're trying. And I actually do it that way. I will try at least 3 times to identify alternative accommodations and go through the whole formal process of assuring that it really is unreasonable, an undue hardship, or even with the accommodation, they're not meeting the expectations of the job. That will be fully documented for the attorneys if, in fact, we need it later. And if I need to, I'll have an unbiased party take a look at my choices before I do that termination decision. And if I did do that termination decision and they bring new information to me in the few weeks or a few months afterwards that say, maybe I made a mistake, I am perfectly happy with retroactively changing that termination decision and making sure I really jumped through all of those hoops, crossed all those T's, and dotted all those I's. Because the effort to do that and the choice you make to make sure your managers are not the ones causing the challenge will mitigate any lawsuits. Thanks, everybody. I hope that was helpful. Have a great rest of the week.